Greenland appears on the map like a mistake of scale, a colossal white mass stretching farther north than any other land on Earth. At over 2.1 million square kilometers, it is the largest island on the planet, a place where distances deceive and survival is never guaranteed. Though geographically tied to North America, Greenland's history has never belonged to one continent, one people, or one era. From the very beginning, it has been something else entirely. A crossroads shaped by ice, endurance, and power. Yet beneath its silence lies a question that has echoed for thousands of years. Why did humans keep coming here at all, when the land itself seemed determined to drive them away? The answer begins long before written history, long before empires or flags, when the Arctic was not a boundary but a pathway. Around 2500 BCE, the first known humans crossed into Greenland from North America, stepping onto a land that offered no forgiveness for mistakes. These were not explorers chasing glory, but survivors following the rhythms of ice, animals, and seasonal light. They arrived knowing that one misjudged hunt, one failed winter shelter, could mean extinction, and yet they came anyway, drawn by something that outweighed fear. Archaeologists would later divide these early inhabitants into cultural phases with names like Independence I, Sakak, and Dorset labels that sound clinical, but conceal extraordinary human stories. Each culture represented a different solution to the same relentless challenge. How to live where trees do not grow, where darkness can last months, and where food moves beneath frozen seas. Some groups mastered stone tools for hunting musk ox and seals. Others refined techniques for surviving along shifting coastlines. And some vanished entirely, leaving behind only fragments of bone, stone, and unanswered questions that still trouble researchers today. These disappearances were not failures of intelligence or courage. They were reminders that Greenland did not negotiate. Climate shifts, changing animal migrations, and subtle environmental pressures could erase entire societies without warning. One generation adapted. The next did not survive. Greenland remembered them all, but the ice kept their secrets. By the time the Thule people arrived around the 12th century, they brought with them something new. A culture perfectly aligned with the sea. Masters of kayak hunting, dog sled travel, and communal survival. The Thule relied on seals, walrus, and narwhal. Animals that thrived even when the land did not. Their technology was light, flexible, and adaptable, designed not to dominate nature, but to move with it. From them emerged the Inuit of Western Greenland, whose knowledge of ice, wind, and migration routes would allow them to endure where others had vanished. And yet, even as the Thule people spread across Greenland's coasts, something strange was happening along the island's southwest edge. Long before the Inuit encountered Europeans elsewhere in the Arctic, Greenland was already hosting outsiders, people whose worldviews, technology, and beliefs had evolved far from the rhythms of the ice. Their arrival would introduce a second, parallel experiment in survival, one that followed very different rules, and whose ending would haunt history. Greenland, it turns out, was never as isolated as it looked. Because while the Inuit adapted to the sea, another society was testing whether European life could be transplanted into the Arctic. They came with cattle, timber needs, iron tools, and a deep belief that land could be shaped to human will. They believed with absolute confidence that faith, farming, and familiarity could tame even the farthest edges of the known world. For a time, they seemed right. What few realize is that Greenland became one of the earliest meeting points between two radically different human strategies for survival. One rooted in flexibility, the other in tradition. And for centuries, they existed side by side, unaware that history was already deciding which approach the ice would tolerate. This is where Greenland's deeper meaning begins to emerge, not as a frozen wilderness, but as a testing ground, a place where ideas about survival, belief, and identity were forced into confrontation. It was here that humans learned, again and again, that endurance did not come from strength alone, but from adaptation. And it was here that the limits of civilization were quietly exposed. If you're finding this story gripping so far, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It helps more people discover stories like this. Stories that reveal how places we think of as distant and empty have shaped the world far more than we ever realized. By the time Europeans began drawing accurate maps of the North Atlantic, Greenland was already layered with forgotten lives and unresolved experiments. Its coastlines held the memory of vanished cultures. Its interior remained an untouched kingdom of ice. And its future, unknown to all who lived there, would one day make it a focal point of global power struggles no one could yet imagine. But before Greenland became valuable to empires, before it mattered to nations and militaries, it mattered to individuals, men and women who wagered everything against cold, hunger, and darkness. Some won, for a time. Others disappeared so completely that even their names were lost. And just as the Inuit perfected survival along the sea, sails appeared on the horizon, carrying people who believed they were arriving at the edge of the world, unaware they were stepping into one of history's most unforgiving crossroads. The Norse did not arrive in Greenland as conquerors marching under banners, but as exiles and opportunists sailing into uncertainty. Around 982 AD, longships cut through the cold Atlantic, carrying families who believed they were leaving behind punishment and scarcity for promise and possibility. At their center was a towering, bullet-le figure, Erik Tered, a man whose temper had already cost him his place in both Norway and Iceland. When he sighted Greenland's jagged coastlines rising from the fog, he could not have known that this land would become both his greatest triumph and history's most unsettling mystery. Erik's discovery was less a revelation than a gamble. The interior of Greenland was a frozen wasteland, but along the southwestern fjords he found narrow strips of grassland during the brief summer months. These valleys offered just enough soil to support grazing animals, and just enough shelter to build farms. After surviving there alone for 3 years, Erik returned east with a plan as audacious as it was deceptive. He called the land Greenland, convinced that a welcoming name would lure settlers westward. The promise worked, but the ocean took its toll. Of the 25 ships that followed him, only 14 reached the shore. Those who survived built the primary settlements, the eastern settlement near Moore and the western settlement closer to present-day Nuuk. Stone farmhouses rose from the tundra. Churches were constructed. Livestock was imported. Against all odds, European society took root in the Arctic. At their height, between 3,000 and 6,000 Norse lived in Greenland, bound together by law, faith, and trade routes stretching back to Iceland and Norway. What sustained them was not farming alone, but commerce. Walrus ivory became Greenland's lifeline to Europe. Tusks were shipped east to supply medieval craftsmen, carving luxury goods for cathedrals and kings. Sealskins, rope, and hides flowed outward, while iron, timber, and prestige flowed in. Greenland was no longer a frontier. It was a node in the medieval world economy, fragile but functioning. And yet, from the very beginning, the Norse settlements balanced on a knife's edge. Unlike the Inuit, the Norse clung to familiar ways of life. They raised cattle and sheep instead of embracing marine hunting. They built heavy structures rather than mobile shelters. Their society was hierarchical, deeply Christian, and anchored in European identity. When Leif Erikson Erik's son sailed even farther west and reached North America around the year 1000, he returned not only with stories of Vinland, but with Christianity itself. By 1126, Greenland had its own bishopric, formally binding the island to Rome. For centuries, the Norse endured storms, isolation, and long winters. They adapted somewhat hunting seals, supplementing diets, but they never fully adopted Inuit techniques, even as the Thule people lived nearby with technologies better suited to the Arctic. Archaeological evidence suggests limited contact between the two cultures. Perhaps trade, perhaps tension. What is clear is that they did not merge. They remained separate worlds, sharing the same unforgiving land. Then the balance began to shift. By the late 13th century, subtle changes crept into daily life. Sea ice lingered longer each year. Growing seasons shortened. Ships from Europe arrived less frequently. Walrus ivory lost its value as elephant ivory from Africa flooded European markets. The Greenland colonies, once marginal but connected, became isolated and expendable. Records grew sparse. Churches fell into disrepair. The Western settlement vanished first, leaving behind empty farms and unanswered questions. Still, the Eastern settlement held on, stubborn, faithful, and increasingly alone. What makes this story unsettling is not just that the Norse struggled, It is that they seem to recognize the danger, yet refuse to abandon their identity. They did not fully adopt Inuit clothing, hunting strategies, or social structures. To do so may have felt like surrender, not just of culture, but of meaning itself. Greenland had been named, claimed, and sanctified. To change too much would be to admit that the gamble had failed, and yet, history was already moving toward silence. By the early 1400s, communication with Europe had nearly ceased. Ships no longer came. Priests were not replaced. Law assemblies faded. The final written record of Norse Greenland is chilling in its ordinariness. A marriage recorded in 1408 at the Church of HVLC. After that, the documents stop. No letters. No pleas for help. No explanations. When later explorers returned centuries afterward, they found ruins, not answers. Stone walls stood roofless. Churches were abandoned. And once, preserved in the ice, they found a body, a Norse man, clothed in sealskin. Face down in the snow, a worn knife beside him. He had died alone, far from home, in a land his people once believed they could tame. Had they starved? Frozen? Left voluntarily? Been absorbed or destroyed? The ice offered no confession. What is certain is that Greenland had tested two civilizations at once, one that adapted by yielding to the environment, and one that resisted by holding on to tradition. One survived, the other disappeared so completely that even its final moments remain unknown. And this mystery would not fade quietly, because across Europe, stories began to circulate. Rumors of lost Christians living at the edge of the world, forgotten colonies waiting to be rediscovered, lands abandoned not because they were empty, but because something had gone terribly wrong. Greenland became not just a place on the map, but a question mark haunting the imagination of explorers. And it was this silence, more than the ice, that would draw the next wave of outsiders back to Greenland's shores. When expeditions finally returned to the abandoned settlements, what they found was not a battlefield, but a slow collapse. Farmhouses stood empty, their walls still strong, but their roofs long fallen. Tools lay where they had been dropped. Churches remained oriented east, toward Rome, even as no priest had stood at the altar for generations. There were no mass graves, no signs of violence. Hustabandonment, the most unsettling evidence of all. One discovery, however, cut through centuries of speculation. Preserved in ice, explorers found the body of a Norse man, face down in the snow. He wore sealskin clothing, evidence of adaptation, and carried a worn knife. There was no sign of struggle. He had not been buried. He had simply fallen, alone, and never risen again. His death was not dramatic, but it was final, and it raised a question that refuses to go away. Was he among the last? The most widely accepted explanation points to climate. Beginning around 1300, the Northern Hemisphere entered the Little Ice Age, a prolonged period of cooling that altered ecosystems across Europe and the Arctic. In Greenland, the effects were devastating. Sea ice expanded, blocking shipping routes. Summers shortened, reducing hay production for livestock. Winters grew longer and harsher. A society built on fragile farming margins found itself increasingly trapped by conditions it could not control. Trade, the lifeline of Norse Greenland, collapsed. Walrus, ivory, once prized, lost its value as elephant ivory flooded European markets. Without trade, iron tools could not be replaced. Timber was scarce. Ships from Europe arrived less frequently, then not at all. Greenland was no longer profitable, no longer strategic, and no longer remembered. The colonies had not just been abandoned by fate, but by the world beyond the horizon. Meanwhile, the Inuit endured. Inuit communities continued to hunt seals along the ice edge, adapting to shifting conditions with technologies the Norse never fully adopted. Their survival did not depend on distant trade networks or imported materials. They moved with the animals. They read the ice. Where the Norse relied on permanence, the Inuit relied on flexibility. Greenland had not become uninhabitable. It had become selective. And yet, climate alone may not explain everything. Some historians suggest disease, malnutrition, or internal social collapse. Others propose limited conflict with Inuit groups, though evidence for widespread violence is thin. There are even theories that the remaining Norse left voluntarily, sailing back to Iceland or Norway when life became unsustainable. If they did, they left no record of it. A disappearance so complete it defies the habits of medieval bureaucracy. What remains most disturbing is not that the Norse failed, but that they failed quietly. They did not leave warnings. They did not record final prayers. They did not reshape themselves fast enough to survive. In Greenland, identity had become a liability. If this mystery fascinates you, liking this video and subscribing helps ensure stories like this. Stories where history whispers, instead of shouts, reach more people who love deep, thoughtful exploration of the past. For Europeans of the following centuries, Greenland became a land of rumor and longing. Were there lost Christians still waiting to be found? Had the Norse converted to Inuit ways? Or had the ice claimed them all? Each unanswered question fed the next expedition, the next map, the next claim. The irony is that Greenland had never disappeared. It had simply stopped speaking in ways Europe could hear. And as Europe entered the age of exploration, chasing sea routes to Asia and new empires across the globe, Greenland re-emerged not as a mystery of survival, but as an obstacle and an opportunity. Ships pressed northward in search of a northwest passage, threading dangerous waters where ice dictated every decision. Whalers followed, traders followed, and slowly Greenland's role shifted again, from forgotten colony to strategic possession. The silence after 1408 had not ended Greenland's story. It had only changed who was listening. By the late 15th and 16th centuries, Greenland had returned to European attention, though now not as a place to colonize, but as a frontier of opportunity and speculation. Ships ventured northward, searching desperately for a northwest passage to Asia. For decades, explorers chased illusions of a waterway that would transform trade and empire, skirting icebergs and storm-tossed seas. Greenland's coasts were mapped in fits and starts, the land alternately a threat and a promise. Yet no European could settle permanently. The ice reasserted its sovereignty. Still, the allure of wealth remained. English and Dutch whalers navigated its frigid waters, harvesting whales and seals, while charting new territories along fjords and inlets. Greenland was no longer empty. It was a resource in a global game few understood fully. In the early 18th century, Denmark returned not as a conquering empire, but as a missionary power. King Frederick IV sponsored expeditions to locate rumored descendants of the Norse and convert them if necessary. Though no Vikings were found, Danish influence gradually spread. Trading posts sprouted along the southwest coast, and the island slowly became integrated into the Danish realm. In 1776, Denmark imposed a formal trade monopoly, cementing its control. Greenland became a colony in all but name, a strategic and economic asset, closed to foreign traders for nearly 2 centuries. Its isolation was preserved, but within it simmered the global forces that would later make it a focal point of modern geopolitics. Exploration continued, fueled by curiosity, science, and ambition. Between 1903 and 1906, Roald Amundsen achieved what many thought impossible. He navigated the Northwest Passage, confirming Greenland's northern seas as both barrier and gateway. Meanwhile, American expeditions, including those led by Robert Peary, charted Greenland's northern reaches, disproving myths that the island extended to the North Pole itself. These voyages were not just feats of endurance. They represented early assertions of influence. Greenland, once a silent witness to human endurance, was now a stage upon which nations tested their reach and ambition. The American interest in Greenland, though later abandoned in diplomatic trade-offs with Denmark, hinted at the island's strategic potential. Its location, bridging North America and the Arctic, meant that Greenland could never truly be ignored. Throughout its history, the island had been a testing ground, first for survival, then for settlement, and finally for power. It was a place where ice and ambition collided, where humans had repeatedly attempted to carve permanence into a transient landscape. Greenland's story, stretching from Inuit migrations to Norse disappearance to European monopoly, was now poised to enter the modern world, a frozen land that mattered not for its warmth, but for its position, resources, and the enduring mystery of human tenacity. By the dawn of the 20th century, Greenland had moved from myth to map, from isolation to global awareness. Today, it continues to occupy a paradoxical place, a land defined by ice, yet inseparable from human endeavor. A land whose silence once masked stories of survival, ambition, and disappearance. A land whose value has always been measured not just in resources, but in the will of people to endure, adapt, and sometimes fail. Greenland's frozen expanses are more than geography. They are history, strategy, and a testament to the relentless human quest to find a place in a world that is often unyielding. The story of Greenland reminds us that history is rarely linear. It is layered, enigmatic, and often shaped by forces larger than any individual or empire. From Inuit hunters to Norse settlers, from missionaries to explorers, Greenland has challenged assumptions about survival, shaped trade and geopolitics, and remained a silent witness to the ambitions of humanity. Even today, as the ice shifts and the world's attention turns northward once more, Greenland's legacy endures, a frozen crossroads where geography's endurance and power continue to intersect, proving that no land is too remote to matter, and no story too cold to captivate.